Hi, everybody, and welcome to our July study of Migrant Stories in the book of Genesis. And as usual, we'll be uploading a video every Monday, and then we'll be hosting a discussion live and on Zoom that will be captured on Wednesdays. So for the 5 upcoming weekends of July, we're looking at these texts, and there are 5 different ways that migration happens in the book of Genesis. We'll circle back and talk a little bit more about those 5 ways, but we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We are going to begin with the 12th chapter of Genesis. If you've been part of my text studies over the years, you'll know that I consider Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 to be one of the most significant texts in all of the scriptures. And I'm not alone in that by any stretch. That's when God calls Abram, or who becomes Abraham, and that's the beginning of the Hebrew story. The first 11 chapters are something like prehistory, as it were. If you have any questions about our setup, just give us a call. Other than that, let's jump right into it. In the 26th chapter of Deuteronomy, this would be the very last part of what's often called the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, sometimes it's called. In the 26th chapter of Deuteronomy, there's some instructions for how to worship for an agrarian community when the first fruits come out of the ground. So this is the harvest centered moment of worship. And you're to bring the first fruits to the holy place that God has designated, a temple or a synagogue or a tent, and you offer them to the priest. And as you offer them to the priest, and the priest puts those fruits on the altar that are there, so you can think about a worship service when you bring in the offering and the ushers take the offering baskets up to the table and they're set on the communion table. That's as close to Presbyterians will ever have to an altar. When the priest sets the gift, the offering, on the altar, the Hebrew is supposed to give a litany of the history of their people, and it begins with this line: "My father," and that's a reference to Abraham, "my father was a wandering Aramean." So if you're a good Hebrew, in this worship moment, your identity is grounded in your ancestor, Abraham, in the fact that he was a wanderer, originally from Aram, and we'll talk about the locations and the geography in a moment. But you identify yourself within a lineage of this wanderer, someone who was not fixed in a land but was moving from place to place. That's why I want to focus on migrant stories, because I think that's a key part of the identity of the people of God. So, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. I'm allowing you to read these on your own, so you might want to stop the video and go get your Bible and open it up. But here are the things I want to observe about it. So if you're going to read it, stop now, read now, and then resume. So the first thing we notice in verses 1 through 3 is that it is the Lord, and again, remember that this program won't allow me to use small caps. It only allows me to either use lowercase or uppercase letters. And but in your Bible, when you see the word Lord written in small caps, remember that's a translation of this 4-letter tetragram name for God. It's the holy name for God. An Orthodox Jewish person, observant Jew, would not try to pronounce that so much as to substitute the word Adonai. And so in this story, it's written about the Adonai, as we saw in the second creation story. And it begins with Adonai. It begins with the call of God. So we often call this a call story. Preachers like to think of it sometimes in terms of the sense of call that we have on our lives. But this is God initiating a call to Abram. At this point, his name is Abram. In Hebrew, that word sounds a lot like the word for father, and it means something like the high father and so forth. So it could be a proper name. It could be a symbolic name in some respects. Now, we are going to emphasize this weekend in worship how God's call to Abram doesn't seem to be predicated on Abram's goodness. You might remember in the Noah and the flood story, God looked on the earth and saw nothing but evil except for Noah. Noah was a righteous man, and so God called Noah to build the ark and be saved. It seems like Noah was selected because of his goodness, but with Abram, it just out of the blue. He's identified earlier as part of a genealogy, as part of a family, a wandering family, but there's nothing about Abram's identity that says he was special, holy, good, exceptional in any way at this point. So we call it a call story because the initiative is all on God's part. It's not God reacting to Abram's faithfulness. It's God issuing something here. And it begins with the verb go. Go. It's a reflexive verb, like go yourself, take yourself, get yourself. Go from your country. And not just your country, but also from your kindred, from your father's house. So this is a severe uprooting, as it were. All of the places where Abram had lived with his father, with his brothers, it looks like, certainly with his spouse, with his nephew, all of these places where Abram had roots in the ground, we're leaving that. And so this, the very beginning of this story of Abram talks about the deep roots that are now being severed for Abram to go. And in some respects, that's why I want to use the word migration. I'm going to be using migration throughout this month to identify someone who takes up residence outside of their kinship network, outside of where they have protections and security and familiarity that kinship networks provide. We'll look at various forms of migration, but that's what's happening here. So right off the bat with Abram's story is he is severing these ties that we normally rely on for our identity, for our security, and so forth. Leave your country, leave your kindred, leave your father's house, and go. That's the call here. And go where? That's the big question, right? And there is a destination. It's not yet going to be clear. And so at this point in the story, just go to the land that I will show you. So this makes a migrant story without a particular identity in mind of where exactly Abram is going to end up. And then comes the promise. So many biblical scholars refer to these first three verses as the promise that God makes to Abraham. And the first part of that promise is, I will make you a great nation. The word for nation is rather interesting. It's actually the Hebrew word goyim, and you may be familiar with that's kind of a modern Jewish expression for Gentiles, for non-Jewish people. And that's a curious thing in both Hebrew and Greek. In Greek, it's ethnos. That's how this would be translated into Greek. And again, ethnos is sometimes translated as nations and sometimes Gentiles, which also would refer to non-Jewish people. So you have a kind of interesting term here. There's probably an evolution of how that term is used within the Jewish community. Originally, it's like God says to Abram, I will make you a great goyim, a great nation. a great people, a great entity. And then over time, that became other nations, not us. But for now, that's who it is. I'm going to look at some Hebrew words as we go along because I think they're relatively significant. I accidentally skipped this one, the land to which God is sending Abram, the land that I will show you. The verb, the noun and the article there is ha-aretz, ha-aretz. You may recognize that name because that's the name of one of the leading newspapers in Israel today. Ha-aretz. It means the land. It's not Adamah, the ground. It is more of a specified area, the land. Both of those terms come into play in our scripture today and throughout these migration stories. So the first thing God promises is, I will make you a great nation. And then, verse 3 is rather interesting. It needs a really close look, and we're going to spend more time on it on Wednesday. But on the one hand, it says, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. So it seems like this land to which God will direct Abram and the nation that God creates there is the focus of God's favor and God's promise. And other nations fare with regard to how they treat this land. But the second half of verse 3 says, in you will all the nations of the earth be blessed. So that seems like a much more universal promise and a little less specified on nations being blessed or cursed, however they treat Israel or Abram's nation. So that's a tension. That's a tension in verse 3. I want you to read that verse very carefully. Think of it as two parts. And on Wednesday, we'll explore a little bit more how that tension tends to play out, I think, as a conversation throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible and even into the New Testament. So that's verses 1 through 3. I think it's very significant. I want you to read it and read it again. But then we have verses 4 through 9. And in verses 4 through 9, we see the response. And the first thing we want to look at are the responders. You have Abram. He's 75 years old. That sounds, senior citizen in our thinking. It's not in this story. We're told back in chapter 11 that Abraham's father, Terah, had children when he was 70 years old. So this is a childbearing sort of age here. One of the people who leaves in response to God's call is Abram. Another is Lot. Lot is Abraham's nephew. He's an orphan. His father, Haran, was Abraham's brother, who apparently died early, even while his own father was still living. So an untimely death for whatever reason. And so Abraham's father, Terah, initially takes care of Lot. And now that Terah is dead, Abraham is kind of overseeing Lot and takes Lot with him. And then Sarah. So just like Abram's name is going to change to Abraham along the way, Sarah's name is going to change a bit. For our sake, it's just one letter. It goes from ending with the letter I to the letter H. The pronunciation's a little different, the meaning's slightly different, but that will happen later. At this point, it's Abram and Sarah, and they take their possessions and the people they had acquired while they were in the area called Haran. I want to give you a homework assignment between now and Wednesday. Imagine the things that Abram, Sarah, and Lot, and the people that they possess, take with them. What possessions do you take when you set out on a journey to God knows where? Literally, God knows where. A land where I will show you. You're leaving, you're uprooting everything you know, your fields, your people, your language, your this, your that, right? And you're packing it all up, and you're hitting the road. We don't know if they had camels, we imagine. They beasts of burden. They carried stuff on their own back. They had wagons, trailers, all that kind of stuff. But you're packing up and leaving at this moment. Imagine, let's come up with a list of the things that we guess they would have taken with them that's covered by this word possessions. All right? Help me fill that list out on Wednesday. But that's the response now. Abram, Lot, and Sarah, and the people they had gotten. So look, slavery of some sort, possessing people is simply taken for granted here. It's not necessarily said this is the ideal life, and it's also not said this is terrible. It just is. They all leave and they take their possessions. So we have a lot of references to geography, and I've told you repeatedly I am terrible at biblical geography. What I say is only what I remember from what I've read, if I remember it correctly. Okay? So, in no wise should you ever take my word for any of this. But if you go back to Genesis chapter 11, the last 7 verses there, 26 through 32, there's a prehistory of Abram's family. It starts with his father, Terah. So they're the genealogy at the beginning of that chapter, right after the story of the Tower of Babel. They're the genealogy, and Terah comes along. I've spelled it here for you. My computer constantly tries to keep changing that to Torah, but it's Terah. That's Abraham's father, and it's identified as having lived in the land of Ur. U-R. That's an area that's in modern-day Iraq. And if you think of the river Euphrates and the Tigris that surround the area called the Mesopotamia, remember that name Mesopotamia means between two rivers. So if you look on a map, you'll see the Euphrates on one side, the Tigris on the other. Area in the middle generally is called Mesopotamia. Ur is there near the Euphrates, down in kind of the southeastern portion of it. Okay? Again, look it up for yourself. Don't trust me. But that's the land of Ur, and technically in chapter 11, it is said that or Abraham's brother, Haran, he's got a brother named Haran. That was Lot's father who died. It says Haran was born in Ur. It seems as if Abraham was as well. And the reason Abraham is called a wandering Aramean, that a wanderer from Aram or Padan Aram, A-R-A-M, is not because of this chapter. It's because later in chapter 24, when Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac is marrying age, Abraham sends him back to the land where I was born to find a wife, and Isaac goes back to Aram. So that's why we consider Abram an Aramean from Aram. The thing is, these names, some of them represent villages, some towns, some represent towns that now are found elsewhere, but still going by that name. And some of them represent regions and areas, and Aram seems to be more of a region there in Mesopotamia. Okay? So, you have Abram's brother, and probably Abram himself, born in Ur, and that's in the larger area of Aram, which is part of Mesopotamia between those two rivers. But then Terah, Abram's father, does something interesting. He moves. He's the original wanderer in this story, and he takes Abram and Lot and Sarah with him. So Haran has already died, and now Terah is leaving, and he aims to go to Canaan. which is interesting because that's where eventually Abram is going to be sent. He aims to go to Canaan. First, he goes up the Euphrates and around a little bit and lands in the city of Haran. And so this is confusing because there's a man named Haran. There's also a city named Haran. They go to Haran, the city. Abraham, Lot, Sarah, with Terah. And they decide that instead of continuing down to Canaan, which would be a significant trip, they stay there. And that's where Terah dies. And that's where we are when this story starts. So we've gone from up to Haran. And they were heading for the land of Canaan. Decided to stay right where they were. Okay, so when Abram is called, they're departing from the city of Haran. They set out for the land of Canaan, which is south and is the area that we now kind of reckon as Israel and Palestine, those areas. We'll recognize some of the cities in just a moment. And that's where they're heading. Now, remember, God just said, go to the land that I will show you. We're not told at any point how God compassed them down in that direction. All we know at this point is that Abram basically is following the original plans that his father Terah had, which was to go to Canaan. And Abram goes from to Haran, and after the call from God, circles up around the, one would guess, around the end of the Euphrates, and starts heading down toward Canaan. And then we're told that they end up in Shechem. So now we're in Canaan proper. Shechem is a very significant city in the Old Testament. At the end of the book of Joshua, so that's the 6th book in the Old Testament. At the end of the book of Joshua, who is Moses' second in command and took over after Moses died, gathers the people of Israel in Shechem, which was something like the first capital of Israel after they had conquered the land. Shechem is like the capital. Joshua gathers the people there. He tells the story of how they got there, going from Abraham down through Moses and the wandering in the wilderness and the wars that they fought. And they make a covenant with God. They have a ceremonial covenant right there in Shechem, each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's a very solemn, celebratory, meaningful thing. And it's happening in Joshua chapter 24, the very last chapter in the book of Joshua. So Shechem is named because that's going to end up being a very, very significant city. They go to the Oaks of Moreh, and I don't know anything about that area, but I will tell you that when Sarah dies, there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that Abraham wants to buy a tomb or an area, a plot in an area called the Oaks of Mamre. And it's a big deal because that's where when Abraham's grandson dies, Jacob, who is renamed Israel, as he's dying, he tells his sons, take my bones back to the Oaks of Mamre, bury me with my ancestors. So that becomes an ancestral burial plot, the Oaks of Mamre. So what that's telling us is that there are certain regions that are known by names and certain regions that are known by the characteristics of the flora that are there. And this is one of them, the Oaks of Moreh. Those names are going to come up in some shape in other stories, but for now they're pretty much just left unidentified. And then they keep going, and they land at a place that's east of Bethel. I hope this is working for you. It's working for me. East of Bethel and west of Ai. So you have Bethel on the west of this place, Ai on the east of this place. And I love the name Ai. Where is it? i.e., that's if you ever think AI is a new thing, it was already here in the book of Genesis. So they end up in this place, which is now in the heart of the land we often call Israel, and that the Old Testament will eventually identify as such. But you know what? That's where we leave it in verse 9. In verse 10, they keep moving. So they've been wandering, all right? And at no point yet has God said, here, stay right here. God doesn't say it in Shechem. God doesn't say it at Bethel. Bethel, the name Bethel, Beat El, means the house of God. That's going to be a significant place in one of the later stories with Jacob. But not yet has God said, yeah, this is it. Lay down your roots right here. They're still traveling, and they're actually going to end up going to Egypt, but we're going to look at that next week. Okay? So, the big thing I want you to see now is just look at some of these details, because this is a story about God's promise, God's grace, first of all. God called Abram out of for no apparent reason except the dint of God's will. God called Abram, so it's a story of grace. God makes a promise, so it's a story of the promise. God promises to make Abram a great nation, so it's the story of the beginning of the nation of Israel. And it's a story of the beginning of Abraham's wandering from Haran, and eventually, by the end of this story, in Israel proper, heading toward Egypt. Okay? So, we're calling this migrant stories, migration stories, and that's different. That's focusing on the Hebrew verb ger, which is often translated in a way that the people, Abraham and his descendants, are often called nomads or semi-nomads. Sometimes ger is translated as a sojourner, sometimes as alien or resident alien. I am following the lead of Theodore Hibbert from McCormick Seminary, who argues that we should use the word migration throughout these stories, and so that's what we're going to do this month. The two big migration stories, of course, are the story of the Exodus, coming up from Egypt into Israel, and the story of the exile, being taken out of Israel up into Babylon. You know, these are the big migration stories. But what I want to show is that this is kind of written into the DNA of the Hebrew people, at least from the beginning. And so you've got migration, which is going to be huge, but think about how that relates to other words that we know are important, like aretz, meaning the land, or adamah, meaning the ground. All of these terms are very, very significant. And the idea of migration has people moving contrary to being rooted there. So that's where we're going to leave it today. I know you're ultimately surprised that this is shorter than 30 minutes, but I've covered a lot. You may want to watch it twice, and we'll talk more on Wednesday. Okay? Thanks. Bye.